On a Wednesday morning in late October of 1987, Merl Ostrander stood at the edge of a gravel pit outside Platte County, Nebraska, and watched a $340,000 Manitowoc crane sit completely motionless, while three men in hard hats argued about what to do next. The boom had come down wrong. The hydraulic rams that controlled the luffing system had seized overnight in the cold, and now the whole machine was locked up like a fist that couldn't open. The crane crew had already been on site for 11 days. The excavation contractor had already burned through $14,000 in delay costs. And the general contractor, a man named Brad Thornton who had built his reputation on never missing a deadline, was standing 20 feet away from Merl with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, staring at a piece of equipment that was costing him money every single hour it sat still. That's the image you need to hold on to. Not the crane, not the gravel pit, not the November sky coming in gray from the northwest. The image you need is Brad Thornton, 41 years old, 15 years in the heavy construction business, a man who had never once called anyone for help that he didn't already know, standing in a field in Platte County, Nebraska, and running out of ideas. Let me tell you about what had already been tried, because you need to understand what exhausted looks like before you can understand what happened next. The first call Brad made was to the Manitowoc Regional Service Rep, a man named Keith Sievert, who drove out from Omaha on a Tuesday and spent 6 hours with a heat gun and a set of factory service manuals trying to coax the rams back into movement. Keith had serviced Manitowoc equipment for 9 years. He knew the machine well. He pulled the hydraulic lines, checked the pressure relief valves, bled the system 3 times, and got nothing. The rams were frozen solid, not from cold in the mechanical sense, but from internal corrosion that had been building inside the cylinder bores for longer than anyone had noticed. Keith told Brad the cylinders would need to be pulled and sent to a machine shop in Lincoln, which would take a minimum of 3 weeks and cost somewhere between $18,000 and $22,000, depending on what they found inside. Brad told Keith to write that up and get out of his way while he thought. The second call was to a hydraulic repair outfit out of Norfolk that advertised mobile service. 2 men arrived in a white van with a compressor and a set of seal kits and spent the better part of a day trying to free the rams with pressure cycling and penetrating oil. They managed to get one ram to move about 3/8 of an inch before it locked again. They charged Brad $1,400 for the attempt and told him they'd done what they could. The third call was to a retired Manitowoc technician named Don Radcliffe, who lived outside Columbus and still kept his tools. Don was 63 years old and had worked on cranes his entire career. He came out on a Saturday, looked at the rams for about 40 minutes and told Brad the same thing Keith had told him, except Don said it in fewer words. He said, "Those cylinders are gone. You're not going to free them in the field." Don didn't charge anything. He just drove back to Columbus. By the time the third man had come and gone, Brad Thornton had spent $17,800 in combined delay costs, service calls, and failed repair attempts, and he was no closer to getting his crane working than he had been on the morning the rams seized. He had a project schedule that was already slipping, a general contractor breathing down his neck, and a machine that was essentially a $340,000 paperweight sitting on a gravel pad in Platte County, Nebraska. That's when Merl Ostrander walked over from the fence line. Let me tell you about Merl because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he offered and why Brad Thornton laughed at it. Merl Ostrander was 64 years old in the fall of 1987. He had farmed the same 280 acres outside Columbus for 38 years, the same land his father had broken in the 1930s and his grandfather had homesteaded before that. He ran a small cow-calf operation alongside the row crops, kept maybe 60 head most years, and had the kind of farm that never made anyone rich but never went under either, because Merl was the kind of man who fixed everything himself and threw nothing away. His shop was a converted dairy barn with a dirt floor and a coal stove in the corner, and it was full of equipment that most people in Platte County had stopped thinking about decades ago. Merl had been watching the crane situation from across the road for 3 days. He watched because he was curious, not because he was looking for an angle. He had driven past the gravel pit on his way to town, seen the Manitowoc sitting still with men standing around it, and started putting together what he was seeing the way a man does when he has spent 40 years diagnosing problems with machinery that doesn't work. He didn't say anything to anyone. He went home, thought about it, went back to his shop, looked at some things, thought some more, and then on Wednesday morning he walked across the road and introduced himself to Brad Thornton. Brad was polite but distracted. Merl told him he'd been watching and thought he might be able to help. Brad asked what he had in mind. Merl said he had a hydraulic ram rebuilding setup in his shop that he'd been using since the early 1960s, and that he thought he could pull those cylinders, bore them out, fit new liners, and have them back in the machine inside of 4 days. Brad looked at him for a moment. He asked Merl what kind of equipment he was talking about. Merl described it. Brad's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes shifted in a way that was not quite respect and not quite dismissal. It was the look of a man who has run out of options but hasn't yet decided to admit it. Let me tell you about the equipment, because this is where the story turns, and you need to know what Merl was actually offering. In 1961, Merl's father Clarence had purchased a Van Norman hydraulic cylinder boring and honing machine from a shop in Fremont that was closing down. The Van Norman had been built in 1948 in Springfield, Massachusetts, by a company that made precision machine tools for the automotive and industrial trades. It was a heavy, deliberate piece of equipment, cast iron throughout, with a boring head that could be adjusted in thousandths of an inch and a honing attachment that could bring a cylinder bore to within half a thousandth of finished size. Clarence had paid $340 for it, which was not a small amount of money in 1961. He had used it to rebuild tractor cylinders, combine hydraulic rams, and occasionally farm equipment for neighbors who needed the work done and couldn't afford to send parts to a machine shop in Lincoln. When Clarence died in 1974, the Van Norman passed to Merl along with the farm and the shop and everything else. Merl kept using it. He kept it calibrated. He kept the boring bars sharp and the honing stones dressed. He had rebuilt cylinders for half a dozen neighbors over the years, mostly on older equipment that nobody else wanted to touch. The machine was 39 years old in 1987, and it worked as well as it had the day Clarence bought it from the shop in Fremont, because it was built from cast iron and precision ground steel, and there was nothing in it that wore out if you kept it clean and used it correctly. That is what Merl Ostrander was offering Brad Thornton. Not a quick fix, not a workaround. A proper machine shop repair, done on a 1948 Van Norman boring machine in a converted dairy barn in Platte County, Nebraska, by a 64-year-old farmer who had been doing this kind of work since he was 26 years old. Brad Thornton listened to all of this. Then he said he appreciated the offer, but he didn't think a farm shop was the right place to be working on Manitowoc crane cylinders. He said it with the particular kind of politeness that men use when they want to end a conversation without being rude. Merl nodded and said he understood and started back toward the fence line. He had gotten about 15 feet when Brad called after him and asked what he would charge. Merl stopped and turned around. He said he'd do it for cost of materials and whatever Brad thought was fair. Brad stared at him for a moment. Then he said, "All right, let me think about it." Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a man try to talk himself out of the only good option he has left? Because that is exactly what Brad Thornton spent the next 2 days doing. He made 2 more phone calls to machine shops in Lincoln and Omaha. He got quotes of $19,500 and $23,000 respectively, with lead times of 3 to 4 weeks. He called Keith Sievert back and asked if there was any other option he hadn't considered. Keith told him there wasn't. Brad sat in his truck for a while. Then he drove back to the gravel pit, found Merl still watching from the fence line, and told him he had the job. Let me tell you about the next 4 days, because they are the reason this story is still being told in Platte County 37 years later. Merl brought his son Gary out to the site on Thursday morning. Gary was 31 years old and had grown up in the shop, and between the two of them they had the kind of working rhythm that doesn't need much talking. They pulled the hydraulic rams from the Manitowoc carefully, documenting every connection and every fitting with a notebook and a Polaroid camera before they disconnected anything. The cylinders were large, each one weighing between 180 and 220 pounds, and they handled them with a shop-built A-frame and a chain hoist that Merl had welded together in the 1970s and never had reason to replace. They loaded the cylinders into Merl's flatbed truck, covered them with moving blankets, and drove them back to the farm. The inside of those cylinders was not pretty. When Merl got the first one on the boring machine and ran a dial indicator through the bore, he found corrosion pitting that ran the length of the cylinder wall, with a maximum depth of about 12 thousandths of an inch in the worst spots. The bore was out of round by nearly 8 thousandths. Keith Sievert had been right that these cylinders couldn't be freed in the field. What Keith hadn't considered was that they could be saved in a shop if the shop had the right equipment and the man running it knew what he was doing. Merl bored each cylinder oversized to clean up the pitting, then fitted sleeve liners that he had Gary drive to a hydraulic supply house in Columbus to have custom made to the board dimensions. The sleeves went in with a light press fit, and then Merl honed the finished bores to the clearance he wanted for the new seals. He worked methodically, checking dimensions at every step, not hurrying anything. The Van Norman ran with the particular sound of a well-maintained precision machine, steady and unhurried, the boring bar turning at the right speed for the material, the cutting tool taking clean chips off the cast iron bore walls in thin curling ribbons. Gary handled the seal replacement and the end cap work, while Merl ran the boring machine. They worked 12-hour days, starting before light and finishing after dark, with the coal stove in the corner of the shop keeping the temperature workable. On the second night, Brad Thornton drove out to the farm to check on the progress. He stood in the doorway of the shop for a while, watching Merl work. He didn't say much. He looked at the Van Norman for a long time. He asked Merl how old the machine was. Merl told him 1948. Brad nodded slowly and went back to his truck. On Sunday morning, 4 days after they had pulled the cylinders, Merl and Gary loaded them back onto the flatbed and drove them to the gravel pit. The crane crew was there, along with Brad Thornton and Keith Sievert, who had come back out because Brad had called him and asked him to be there when the cylinders went back in. Merl and Gary reinstalled everything in reverse order, working from the Polaroid photographs and the notebook, reconnecting every fitting exactly as it had been. When the last line was torqued and the system was bled, Brad climbed into the operator's cab and cycled the luffing control. The boom moved, not tentatively, not partially. It moved through its full range of motion, smooth and controlled, the way it was supposed to move when the machine was new. The crane crew stood in a loose group and watched it happen, and for a moment, nobody said anything at all. Then one of the riggers, a big man named Dave, who had been on the site since day one, said something under his breath that made the man next to him laugh, and then the whole group was talking at once. Keith Sievert walked over to where Merl was coiling up a hydraulic line and stood there for a moment. He said, "That's clean work." Merl said he appreciated it and kept coiling the line. Brad Thornton came down out of the cab and walked over to Merl. He put out his hand. Merl shook it. Brad asked what he owed him. Merl had a piece of paper in his shirt pocket with the material's cost written on it. $847 in sleeve stock, seal kits, and honing compound. Brad looked at the paper. He looked at Merl. He reached into his jacket and wrote a check for $4,000 and told Merl it wasn't enough, but it was what he had on him. Merl folded the check and put it in his shirt pocket next to where the materials list had been. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Let me tell you about what happened in the months that followed, because the story of Merl Ostrander and the Van Norman boring machine didn't stay in Platte County for long. Word travels in the construction and agricultural equipment world the way it travels in any small community, which is to say faster than you expect and with more detail than you'd think possible. Brad Thornton told Keith Sievert about the repair in more detail than he'd intended to, and Keith mentioned it to a colleague in the regional service network, and that colleague mentioned it to a crane rental outfit in Grand Island that had been having recurring hydraulic problems with an older Bucyrus Erie unit they couldn't quite afford to retire. The Grand Island outfit called Brad, who gave them Merl's number. Merl told them to bring the cylinders out. That was in December of 1987. By the spring of 1988, Merl had done cylinder work for 3 construction companies, a municipal utility district that maintained its own backhoe fleet, and a custom harvesting operation out of York County that had a combine hydraulic system with a bore that had been out of spec for 2 seasons. He wasn't advertising. He wasn't looking for work. People were finding him because someone who had seen the results told someone else who needed the same thing. Let me tell you about Gary, because Gary's role in this story is not a footnote, and you need to understand what he was watching during those years. Gary Ostrander had grown up in the shop the way some kids grow up in libraries or churches, absorbing the culture of the place without being entirely aware that it was shaping him. He had watched his father work since he was old enough to hand tools, and he had learned the Van Norman by doing, the same way Merl had learned it from Clarence. But Gary had also gone to Central Community College in Columbus and taken the machine tool technology program, and he had a theoretical understanding of what the boring machine was doing that Merl had arrived at through experience rather than instruction. The combination made Gary unusually capable, and by 1988 he was doing much of the cylinder work himself while Merl supervised and handled the customer conversations. Gary had also started keeping a log. Not a formal business record, just a spiral notebook where he wrote down every job they did. The machine, the cylinder dimensions, the amount of material removed, the liner specifications, the seal sizes, the hours worked, the outcome. By the end of 1988, that notebook had 43 entries. By the end of 1989, it had 91. Gary could look at a cylinder and tell you within a few thousandths what the bore was going to need before he put a dial indicator in it, because he had seen enough of them to develop a feel for what corrosion and wear do to a bore over time and under pressure. Now, let me tell you about the phone call that came in the spring of 1990, because this is where the story takes on the dimension that made it worth telling to you today. A man named Rick Prescott called from a construction equipment dealership in Kearney. Rick was 38 years old and he ran the service department for a dealer that handled link belt cranes and a line of European hydraulic excavators that had been coming into the American market through the late 1980s. Rick had a reputation in the central Nebraska equipment world as a man who knew his machines and didn't have much patience for people who didn't. He called because he had a customer with a link belt crane that had a hydraulic cylinder problem, and two of his own technicians had already told him the cylinder was beyond repair and needed to be replaced. The replacement cylinder was on back order from the factory with a 12-week lead time. Rick had heard about Merl from Brad Thornton, who had mentioned the gravel pit story at an equipment dealer meeting in Lincoln. Rick called not because he believed Merl could help, but because he was running out of time and wanted to be able to say he had tried everything. He described the problem to Merl over the phone. Merl asked him a series of questions about the cylinder dimensions, the type of corrosion, whether the rod was pitted or just the bore, and what the operating pressure of the system was. Rick answered the questions, and Merl was quiet for a moment, and then Merl said he thought he could fix it. Rick said he'd have his driver bring the cylinder out. The cylinder arrived on a Tuesday. Merl put it on the boring machine and found what he expected to find. A bore that was salvageable with a sleeve liner and a rod that needed to be built up with chrome plating and ground back to size. The chrome plating was outside what the Van Norman could do, but Merl had a relationship with a chrome plating shop in Columbus that did industrial work, and he had the rod back in 3 days. The total repair took 9 days. Rick Prescott drove out to pick up the cylinder himself. He stood in the shop for a while, looking at the Van Norman the way Brad Thornton had stood in the doorway 2 years earlier. He picked up the finished cylinder and turned it in his hands, looking at the bore with a flashlight. He set it down. He looked at Merl. He said, "This is better than factory spec." Merl said he appreciated that and asked if he wanted coffee. Rick said he did. They sat in the shop on 2 mismatched stools with coffee in mugs that had the Columbus Huskers logo on them, and Rick asked Merl how many cylinders he had done. Merl called over to Gary, who was at the boring machine on another job. Gary said 91, not counting the current one. Rick sat with that number for a moment. He said, "How many didn't work out?" Gary said 3, all from the early days before they had worked out the sleeve fit tolerances for the harder alloy cylinders on European machines. Merl said those 3 customers had gotten their money back and the cylinders had eventually been replaced. Rick nodded. He drank his coffee. Before Rick left, he asked Merl if he had ever thought about doing this work more formally. Merl said he didn't know what more formally would look like. Rick said he meant a proper shop, proper invoicing, maybe a relationship with dealers who could send him work when they had cylinders that were back-ordered or beyond what their own service departments could handle. Merl said he'd think about it. He did think about it. He talked to Gary about it that evening at the kitchen table. Gary's wife Linda was there, and she listened to the conversation without saying much for a while, and then she said that if they were going to do it properly, they should do it properly, meaning a real business structure, a proper rate schedule, and a shop that was set up for the volume rather than just making do with what they had. Gary agreed with her. Merl thought about it some more and said he'd sleep on it. Let me tell you about what Merl decided, because the decision he made is the part of this story that most people in Platte County didn't expect. He said no to the formal business arrangement, not because he didn't see the value in it, and not because he was opposed to the work. He said no because he was 67 years old, and he had a farm to run, and he had spent his life doing things at the pace that made them right, rather than the pace that made them profitable. He told Gary that if Gary wanted to build something from it, Gary should build it. But Merl was going to keep doing what he had always done, which was fix what needed fixing when someone brought it to him, and charge what seemed fair, and not let the business become something that ran him instead of the other way around. Gary thought about that for a week. Then he called Rick Prescott back and told him he was interested in talking about a more formal arrangement, but that it would be Gary's operation, not Merl's, and that it would stay in the same shop with the same equipment until there was a reason to change either of those things. Rick said that was fine with him. He said the work was what mattered, not the letterhead. Gary Ostrander's cylinder rebuilding operation out of the old dairy barn in Platte County never got very big. That was by design. At its peak, in the mid-1990s, Gary had 2 part-time machinists working with him and a client list that included 4 equipment dealers, 2 municipal fleet operations, and a handful of construction companies spread across a 4-county area. He had replaced the Van Norman with a newer boring machine in 1993, but he had kept the old one in the corner of the shop, still calibrated, still functional, because Gary was his father's son, and you don't throw away a machine that still works. Merl died in the winter of 1997. He was 74 years old. The funeral was at St. John's Lutheran in Columbus, and the pews were fuller than most people expected, because Merl had not been the kind of man who made a point of being known. But the people who had brought him cylinders over the years knew what he had done for them, and a fair number of them drove in from across the county to sit in those pews. Brad Thornton was there, Rick Prescott was there, Keith Sievert was there. The man named Dave, who had been the rigger at the gravel pit in 1987, was there, which surprised Gary when he saw him because Dave had driven in from Grand Island and Gary hadn't known he was coming. After the service, Gary stood outside the church in the cold and talked to Brad Thornton for a while. Brad said he still thought about that Sunday morning in the gravel pit sometimes when the boom moved and everybody stood there not saying anything. He said he had been in the construction business for 30 years and he had never seen anything quite like it. Gary said his dad had a way of making things look simpler than they were. Brad said that was exactly right. Let me tell you about what happened in the shop after Merl was gone, because the story has one more turn, and it's the turn that matters most. Gary kept the operation going. He was good at it, and the work was steady, and he had learned enough from both the Van Norman years and the formal operation years to know what he was doing and why. His son Nathan started coming into the shop in the early 2000s when Nathan was 12 or 13, doing what Gary had done at the same age, which was hand tools and watch and listen and gradually understand. Nathan was different from Gary in the way that every generation is different, which is to say he had grown up with computers and could look up bearing specifications and honing stone grades on the internet in the time it used to take to find the right catalog. But he had the same patience with the work that Gary had and that Merl had had before Gary. The patience that comes from understanding that a cylinder bore doesn't care how fast you want to be done with it. In 2009, Nathan was 19 years old and home from his first year at the University of Nebraska, and he spent the summer in the shop. One afternoon, he came to Gary with a question that Gary had been half expecting for a while. He asked why they were still doing the sleeve liner method for the badly pitted cylinders, when there was a thermal spray process that could build up the bore wall directly without removing as much material. He had read about it in a journal article he'd found online. He had the article with him printed out on 6 pages of copy paper. Gary read the article. He put it down on the workbench. He looked at Nathan for a moment. He thought about a boy sitting in a shop doorway in 1987 watching his father bore a Manitowoc cylinder on a 1948 Van Norman machine while a construction contractor stood in the dark and tried to understand what he was seeing. He thought about a kitchen table conversation in 1990 and what his mother had said about doing things properly. He thought about a check for $4,000 folded into a shirt pocket. He said, "Let's look into it." They did look into it. The thermal spray process took 2 years to integrate properly because Gary was not going to put a process into service until he was confident it was right, which is the same reason the Van Norman had worked as well as it did for as long as it did. By 2011, they were using it selectively on cylinders, where the sleeve liner approach would have required removing more material than Gary was comfortable with. It extended the range of what they could save by a meaningful margin. Nathan finished his degree in mechanical engineering in 2012 and came back to Platte County. He is still there. The shop is still in the converted dairy barn, though the dairy barn has been expanded twice since Gary first started taking on formal work in the 1990s. The boring machine that replaced the Van Norman in 1993 is still in service. The Van Norman is still in the corner, still calibrated, still functional. Gary is in his late 60s now and works fewer hours than he used to, but he still comes in most mornings and still has opinions about bore clearances and honing stone selection that Nathan has learned to take seriously. Now let me tell you one last thing, because this is the part of the story that nobody outside of Platte County knows, and it is the part that tells you what the whole thing was really about. In 2015, a construction equipment dealer in Kearney, not Rick Prescott's old operation but a newer outfit, brought Gary a hydraulic cylinder from a Liebherr excavator that their own service department had condemned as unrepairable. The bore was badly corroded, the rod was pitted, and the factory replacement was available but expensive. The dealer's service manager, a man in his mid-30s named Jason Covington, came out with the cylinder and spent some time in the shop while Gary and Nathan looked it over. Jason was polite and professional and clearly knew his machines, but he had the particular manner of a man who is not entirely sure why he's been sent to a converted dairy barn in Platte County when there are proper machine shops in Lincoln and Omaha. Gary put the cylinder on the machine and ran the dial indicator through the bore. He called Nathan over and they looked at the numbers together. Gary said they could save it. Jason asked how. Gary explained the process: the boring, the thermal spray, the honing, the seal replacement. Jason listened carefully. Then he asked how long Gary had been doing this kind of work. Gary said since 1987, when his father fixed a Manitowoc crane cylinder for a contractor named Brad Thornton in a gravel pit outside Columbus. Jason said he didn't know that story. Gary said most people didn't. The cylinder was done in 8 days. Jason came back to pick it up and stood in the shop the way Brad Thornton had stood in the doorway in 1989, and Rick Prescott had stood with his coffee mug in 1990, turning the finished cylinder in his hands and looking at the bore with a light. He set it down. He said it was good work. Gary said he appreciated it. Jason asked if they took on work from other dealers in the region. Gary said they did. Jason said he'd pass the name along. Gary said that would be fine. On the way out, Jason stopped at the corner of the shop where the Van Norman was sitting. He looked at it for a moment. He asked what it was. Nathan told him, a 1948 Van Norman hydraulic cylinder boring machine purchased by his great-grandfather Clarence Ostrander in 1961 from a shop in Fremont, Nebraska for $340. Jason looked at it for another moment. He asked if it still worked. Nathan said yes. Jason asked why they kept it if they had the newer machine. Nathan thought about it for a second and said, "Because it's the reason any of this exists." Jason nodded slowly. He looked at the machine one more time. Then he went out to his truck and drove back to Kearney. Let me tell you about what that machine represents, because I want you to understand it before we're done here. That Van Norman boring machine is not a museum piece. It is not a decoration or a sentimental object or a monument to the past. It is a functioning precision machine tool that is 77 years old and can still hold tolerances that matter in a working cylinder. Clarence Ostrander bought it because he needed it and couldn't afford to send work to a shop in Lincoln every time a hydraulic ram went down. Merl kept it because he understood what it could do and because he was not the kind of man who threw away something that still worked. Gary kept it because it was his father's and because it was the machine that started everything. Nathan keeps it because he is smart enough to know that the thing which started everything should not be discarded just because something newer came along. There is a philosophy in that decision that goes beyond sentiment. The Van Norman works because it was built correctly, from the right materials, with the right tolerances, by people who understood what precision machinery needed to do and built it to do that thing without compromise. It has outlasted dozens of machines that were built after it, many of them built with better materials and more modern manufacturing methods, because it was built to be maintained and because the people who owned it maintained it. That is not a small thing. That is in fact the whole thing. Merl Ostrander was not a businessman. He was not an entrepreneur. He was not a visionary in any sense that would appear in a business school case study. He was a farmer in Platte County, Nebraska, who understood hydraulic cylinders better than the factory-trained technicians who had been sent to fix a crane, and who had the equipment to prove it, and who offered to help when help was needed, and who charged $847 for materials and accepted $4,000 as payment and thought that was more than fair. He did not advertise. He did not expand. He did not build a brand. He fixed what needed fixing, and he went home. What he left behind was not a business, it was a practice, a way of working that his son inherited and his grandson is still carrying in the same converted dairy barn, with the same coal stove in the corner, with the same Van Norman in the corner of the shop that Clarence bought from a man in Fremont in 1961. The clients are different and the machines are more complex and the thermal spray process is something Clarence could not have imagined. But the core of the thing is the same. You understand the problem, you have the right equipment, you do the work correctly, and you charge what's fair. Brad Thornton retired from the construction business in 2004. He sold his equipment and his company to a larger regional contractor and moved to a place outside Lincoln where he kept a small shop and worked on old machinery for his own satisfaction. Gary heard from him occasionally over the years, a phone call now and then, sometimes a Christmas card. In 2018, Brad called Gary to tell him he had found an old Manitowoc service manual at an estate sale and thought Gary might want it for the shop. Gary said he'd be glad to have it. Brad drove it out himself, which was a 2-hour trip from Lincoln, and he and Gary sat in the shop for an afternoon and talked. Nathan came in partway through and sat on a stool and listened. Brad told the story of the gravel pit the way people tell stories they have told many times, with the particular rhythm that comes from having worked out which details matter and which ones don't. He got to the part where the boom moved and he stopped for a moment. He said it was still the clearest thing he could remember from 30 years in the construction business. The whole crew standing there, not saying anything, and the boom moving through its full range, smooth and controlled, like the machine was new. Gary said his dad would have been glad to hear that. Brad said he knew it. The Manitowoc service manual is on a shelf in the shop in Platte County, Nebraska, next to a spiral notebook that Gary started in 1988 and filled up by 1993, and next to the notebooks that came after it, each one labeled by year in Gary's handwriting and later in Nathan's. There are 22 notebooks on that shelf. They represent more than 3 decades of cylinder work, more than 1,000 jobs, more than 1,000 problems that someone decided were beyond repair until they brought them to a converted dairy barn outside Columbus and found out they weren't. The Van Norman is in the corner. The coal stove is still there, though it runs on propane now because coal got hard to find in Platte County sometime in the 1990s. Nathan comes in before light most mornings, the same as Gary did. The same as Merl did before Gary. He checks the machine, he looks at what's on the schedule, he starts the stove, and he goes to work. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. And some men don't become legends in any way that makes the news or gets written up in trade publications or talked about at equipment dealer meetings in Lincoln. They just do the work year after year in the same shop with the same machines until the work itself is the legend and the man is just the reason it started. That's what happens when you spend 40 years understanding something that everyone else stopped thinking about. That's what happens when a 64-year-old farmer walks across a gravel pit and offers to fix what 3 factory-trained technicians couldn't. That's what happens when a 1948 Van Norman boring machine, purchased for $340 in 1961, turns out to be the most valuable piece of equipment in a 4-county area, not because it's the most powerful or the most modern, but because it's in the hands of someone who knows exactly what it can do and has the patience to let it do it. The Van Norman is still in the corner. Nathan knows what it's worth, not in dollars, in everything else.